welcome back to On the Ball, the podcast from the Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. I'm Andrew Maraniss, and our guest today is a fantastic author of narrative nonfiction and biographies, Adam Henig, who's joining us from the Bay Area of California. Adam has a new book coming out in early April, a biography of Ron LeFlore, baseball's Outcast, the story of Ron LeFlore. Adam, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Andrew, thank you for having me.
I know I've been aware of your book. I think I let you down in terms of writing a blurb for it, so I apologize about that profusely. But now that the book's about to come out, I'll do what I can to help promote it. I know what an important period this is, early in a book's run. So just grateful for the chance to talk to you about this story of a character that brings back memories from my childhood.
Oh, great. Well, I'm looking forward to talking to you.
And I was really interested to see that for you, it's like Ron LeFlore is a name that goes back to your childhood also, and your mom looking for ways to get you interested in reading, and thinking that sports books might do the trick. It's something I've turned my attention to as an author, is writing books for kids that use sports as a way to tell other stories, but really just I feel like a sports book is not intimidating necessarily to a kid, and maybe that's what gets them to open the cover, and to dive into a book. What was that story of your mom and learning the story of Ron LeFlore?
Well, when I was a kid, I was obsessed with sports, particularly baseball. I grew up in the Bay Area, like you mentioned, and I was an Oakland A's fan. And this was the era of the Bash brothers, Mark McGuire, Jose Canseco. And it was just a great time to be a sports fan living in the San Francisco Bay Area. Um, and I wasn't much of a reader. I had just didn't gravitate to it. However, if it had anything to do with baseball, I would just devour it. It started with baseball cards, and then I would read magazines, and then eventually books. And we were at the library. My mom wanted me to check out a book, and she found this book in the children's section, and it was called From Prison to the Major Leagues. So it was basically a youth version of his autobiography, and it was very interesting. I wasn't familiar with Ron. I didn't grow up. I'm a little younger than when he was during his playing days, so I don't remember him as a player. But reading that story, obviously, there are very few, not baseball players, but just in general, professional athletes who had served prison and then somehow miraculously create a professional sports career afterwards. It's highly unusual, as I explained in the book. Um, but his story was fascinating, and it always stuck with me. And then of course I had watched the movie as well, which starred LeVar Burton, who had just finished Roots. And I was curious, after having written my third book, who was I going to write about next? I wanted to do something very different. I was thinking about doing a sports figure, but of course, I didn't want to just do another athlete. I wanted to do something that had something much more than just what they did on the field. So I was curious what had happened to Ron LeFlore, and the more I learned about him, the more I realized this would be a great topic for my next book.
Hmm. And you mentioned that you've written other books, sports and non-sports. For those who aren't familiar, tell us a little bit about the other books you've written.
Well, it started with Alex Haley, who some of your listeners may know as the author of Roots, also the ghostwriter for the autobiography of Malcolm X. But before that, he was a journalist. In fact, his claim to fame before the Malcolm X book was he was the one who started the Playboy interview series, which went on for essentially for the next 50 years and was probably the most popular feature other than the pinup girl in the magazine. And he did the first one. Um, and I was anyway, so I was curious what had happened to Alex Haley because I feel like he just kind of fell off the radar after Roots. Of course, Roots was a bestseller, And the movie that was based on the book was at that time the most watched television program in the history of television. And so, um, but then all of a sudden, within a few years, it was as if he disappeared. And I was curious what happened. And that ended up becoming the subject of my first book. And then, thanks to Alex Haley, he gave me the subject of my second book, which was about a little known physician in St. Petersburg, Florida, named Ralph Wimbish. And Haley had tracked down Ralph Wimbish in 1960 because in Florida at that time, this was in spring training, the hotels were segregated. So the baseball players, like the Yankees, the St. Louis Cardinals, when they traveled down there for spring training, the black players or anyone who wasn't white was not allowed to stay with them in the hotels. So even though Major League Baseball had been integrated since 1947, spring training was not, and it was going to continue that way until Dr. Wimbish said, "You know what? I'm not going to do this anymore." You see, he had been paid every year at the start of spring training to find homes for the black players on the New York Yankees and the St. Louis Cardinals. And St. Petersburg at that time was the biggest market for spring training. The entire town's economy revolved around those 6 weeks. And so when Wimbish did this, it completely disrupted spring training as well as what was going on in St. Petersburg. And his actions led ultimately to the integration of hotel lodging accommodations throughout the state of Florida and, of course, eventually throughout the South. And unfortunately, other than Alex Haley, no one had ever written anything of substance about Dr. Wimbish. And so when I came across that article, I thought, you know what, this would make a great topic for a book. And then the other person that I wrote about was also associated with Alex Haley. So after Roots, Alex Haley knew he was never going to be able to write anything of that caliber again. So he was searching for a new topic. And one of the topics that he considered was the security guard who had detected the burglars at the Watergate office building. And of course, those burglars led to the connection with President Nixon, who was the first and only president to have ever resigned from the nation's highest office. And this security guard, whose name is Frank Wills, was for a couple of years quite a name in American pop culture. In fact, one magazine attributed called him America's folk hero. Unfortunately, Frank, who wasn't college educated, in fact, he didn't even have a high school degree, and was unfortunately taken advantage of by an unscrupulous agent, um, ended up not turning out so well. And so I wrote about his story before Watergate, what happened to him during Watergate, and then the years afterwards. And so thanks to Alex Haley, he gave me the topic of my first two books. And at that point, that's where I was stuck and I was looking for something else. And then Ron LeFlore popped up.
And you've got you can say, what's the connection between Alex Haley and Ron LeFlore? It's LeVar Burton, right? So,
There you go. Yeah. I mean, just going back to Alex Haley, he was so ahead of his time. Just think about it. This black journalist starting in the 1950s, he was writing for The Atlantic, Cosmopolitan, Playboy, Reader's Digest. I wasn't able to confirm it, but essentially he really was the first black popular national magazine writer in America. I couldn't really find anyone else who who had met his caliber that was also African American. And he was such a trailblazer, Alex Haley, and it's unfortunate what happened to him after Roots.
mhm. All right, let's get back to Ron LeFlore.
Of course.
You mentioned that you're a little younger than to remember him as a player. I do a little bit, and I remembered that there was that movie and that he was on the same teams with Mark the Bird, Fidrich, and like the characters on those Tiger teams. Um, for those who maybe just know the name in passing, that they think maybe they know that this was a guy who was in prison, then he ends up in the major leagues. What's the story leading up to him being in prison in Michigan? I know his family came, like so many other black families, from the deep South. try to find better opportunities in Detroit. What's that history of the LeFlore family?
Well, it's pretty much a story that you would expect given Ron's roots. So his dad, who was in Memphis with his then wife Georgia, the opportunities were, of course, in the north. So he leaves to go to Detroit, which is just booming during World War II and afterwards. And once he gets settled in, he sends for his wife and her two sons from a previous relationship. And then when they settle in Detroit, Ron and his younger brother are born. And unfortunately, the good times don't last. And by the early 1950s, Detroit begins to go in a decline that it really never recovers from. And eventually, of course, the city goes into bankruptcy. But Detroit's manufacturing industry starts being decimated. The workforce leaves for the suburbs. And families like the LeFlores begin to really struggle. Public services dwindle. The schools are just are not receiving enough funding to make them adequate. And Ron's family is constantly struggling with financial issues to the point where this was kind of a struggle with Ron. He was a young boy when he came home unexpectedly and found his mom sleeping with the landlord because she couldn't pay the rent. And she had told him afterwards, don't tell anyone, especially your father. This is the kind of life that Ron was growing up in. It was filled with violence, it was filled with drugs, it was filled with alcohol. And unfortunately, it was filled with a lot of opportunity to get in trouble with the law, which Ron basically started doing as soon as he was 11 years old. And it just didn't stop until eventually he and a group of friends robbed a bar and was sent to prison. And he was there in a maximum security prison for 3.5 years. And it was within a year of being there, he realized, you know what? I'm either going to be behind bars my whole life, I'm going to be dead, or I can turn this around. And somehow he found it in him to to figure out how he was going to turn it around. And he was very fortunate enough to be in that particular prison at that time because the warden was a very forward-thinking individual. He was very different from what traditional prison wardens had done. He actually believed in recidivism. He believed that recreation can help with rehabilitation. And so he provided a lot of opportunities and services for the inmates, including recreational sports leagues. And Ron took full advantage of that. He was an athlete, but he had never played baseball, organized baseball before. In fact, his sports that he preferred were football and basketball. But he tried baseball. He saw that it was very popular in the league and it could lead to an early release. And he was a natural. He was fast. He had great agility. And he just picked up the game really quickly. And again, good luck is really the theme of Ron's story because not only did I mention about this warden, but then the manager of the team happens to have a connection with a Detroit bar owner who was the best man in, at that time, Tiger manager Billy Martin's wedding. And so this manager, who was at one point a prospect, but never made anything of it, contacted this bar owner who he was friends with, who also had mafia connections, and was telling him about this guy, Ron LeFlore. You got to check out this kid. And I was able to find someone who had a letter, one of these letters that the prison team manager had sent the bar owner. And it talks about everything about Ron and how fast he is and how the Tigers have to give him a tryout. You know, Billy Martin, make it happen. And so eventually the team, um, it's not really connected with these letter writings, but the team wanted to do this goodwill tour, and Billy Martin was a part of it. And so they come to the prison one day, and unfortunately, Ron was hoping to do a tryout in front of Billy Martin and some of the players and coaches who accompanied him. but because of the weather, it didn't work out. So Martin had promised him that, if you're ever in town, give me a call. We'll set something up. Well, sure enough, Ron is able to get a furlough. Again, another service that was provided by this warden to incentivize inmates to have good behavior. And so this furlough allowed Ron to leave the prison for 48 hours and have a scheduled tryout at Tiger Stadium. And of course, during the tryout, Ron just takes full advantage of it and impresses Billy Martin, impresses everyone who's there. No one knew except for Martin and maybe one or two other people that Ron was coming from prison. They didn't know that he was actually on furlough. They just assumed, he was just a local kid. Um, and so Ron, when the Tigers work with the prison to get him released early, and he gets signed and sent to Clinton, Iowa for his first professional baseball experience.
Such a obviously the phrase "one in a million" has been used about Ron LeFlore story. But it truly is. What did you learn about what prison life was like for him, just day to day? I know you had some sources that served time with him there. Other than the baseball tryout, what was prison like for Ron LeFlore?
Well, first of all, I had the great fortune of actually talking to Ron himself. So it was the first phone call I made that was associated with this book. Was I was able to get in contact with Ron to see if he'd be willing to be interviewed for this book. So it's not a memoir, it's not a collaborative biography, it's not formally authorized.
Mhm.
But Ron was willing to sit down, and I say sit down, I mean it was all done by telephone, but he was willing to talk with me for essentially, I would say like 30 or 40 interviews we did together over the course of 5 years. And I would talk to him about various topics, including his life behind bars. And the word that keeps popping up when I spoke to him was it was a nightmare. Um, Keep in mind, Ron came from a pretty tough background. And he had, by the time he was 15, 16 years old, he had pretty much experienced pretty every element that you can think of in terms of from prostitutions, drugs, mafia, stabbings, killings. He had seen it all, but yet it doesn't prepare you for life behind bars. And between being in solitary confinement for weeks, getting a haircut, sitting in a barber's chair, and then having someone come up to the person next to you and basically stab the person like 40 something times
Mm.
right in front of you. And you have to keep a straight face because you don't want to be the next victim. Um, Having an inmate in the next cell over be doused with gasoline and then someone throwing a match and lighting him on fire. I mean, it's just it's incomprehensible what he went through. He did write a memoir, and in that memoir, he does describe what life is like. And I think he does it's pretty vivid. But talking to him and then talking to a couple of people who actually served time with when he was there as well, um, it allowed me to try to transport the reader into what life was like in this prison.
Yeah, and I can't imagine the pressure then when he goes for this tryout, you know, seeing this as was the fact that he eventually signs with the Tigers um, a part of his release from prison that he had to show that he had employment. So there was a lot riding on this tryout.
There was. I don't think he even thought about it to that degree. I think keep in mind, Ron had never played. The only people he really played in front of course, were traveling teams that came to the prison and fellow inmates. So he was very nervous. I think deep down he just didn't want to screw up.
Yeah.
But the one thing that Ron had shared with me is that having gone through as much as he did, he told himself, if I can make it through prison, I can make it through this trial.
Yeah.
It's so many words. And so it all worked out. Again, he was very nervous in the beginning of that tryout, and then he settled down. And then of course his natural ability just took over. But yes, the Tigers, it was a win-win for everyone. It was a win for Ron, of course, because he was released early and he had a job waiting for him. It was a win for the Tigers, who at that time, first of all, this was an aging team that needed some new blood. Here was a hometown kid that could get some people in the seats. And this was a club that was a little late on the integration efforts. And they didn't have that many African American players, other than at that time Gates Brown and Willie Horton. It was pretty much an all-white team. And recognizing that the demographic in the Detroit metro area was becoming more and more non-white, they really needed to find people of color to basically kind of offset this all whiteness, especially at a time when so many other teams were much more integrated than the Tigers had been. Um, and lastly, the prison. The prison was able to tout Ron as a shining example of the programs and services that they were instituting. So it benefited everyone, and it's again, it was just incredible that Ron was able to, within such a short period of time, get out of prison and start playing for a professional baseball club.
And then relatively short amount of time where he's signed that he actually makes it to the major leagues, without any real you think about all the money that parents are spending now on travel baseball and private lessons and what it takes to they think what it takes to just, maybe play in college or to get drafted, and then what percentage of players that play in the minors even make it to the major leagues. I mean, it makes his story even all the more remarkable. But what was the short journey to the major leagues from the time he signs to the time he gets to the Tigers?
It was short. It was about 13 months, which even by any standards is quick. Um, Ron felt like time was of the essence. And so he knew that he didn't have 5 years. First of all, the Tigers, it's not clear because there's a lot of contradictory statements, but Ron was old for a rookie. So he was born in 1948. This is 1973 now. So he's 25, 26 years old. That's very
Mhm.
old for a rookie. And the Tigers said that he was actually 22 when they brought him in. So there's some controversy about that. But Ron first so Ron played for three different minor league clubs. The first one was single A. It was the Clinton Pilots, and it was in Iowa. And so not only is Ron adjusting to civilian life, not only is he learning this game while his fellow teammates have been playing this game for like 15 years, have been playing probably since they knew how to walk, because he's still learning all of the little intricacies of the game. As an outfielder, there's so many different things that you have to pay attention to, like what's the pitch count, who's on base, where are they likely to hit it. It's not instinctual for him. So he has to learn all of these things. And again, this is where good luck comes for him as well. Jim Leland is his manager, who of course is a future Hall of Famer. Um, Leland, this was his first gig as a minor league coach, as a minor league manager, and he took Ron under his wing. And Ron took full advantage of it. He would show up to practice early. He would show up well before everyone else did when there was a game, and they would practice. He would practice on his defensive drills. He would practice on his swinging, on his hitting. He would learn. He would tutor him when they were in the dugout, and their team was up at bat. And so Ron had a great mentor that first year, even though he didn't get as much playing time as he would like because the team was pretty good, and they actually ended up producing something like five or six Major League Baseball players, which is quite a lot for a single A club. And eventually, Ron is the season ends, and Ron goes down to Florida for some additional training. And then when spring training starts, he gets picked up by the Lakeland Tigers. So again, it's basically a lateral move. It's another single A club. And he's in the Florida League or Florida Baseball League. And it's there that he begins to really show his potential. And so Ron just tears it up from the first game onward. He's hitting home runs, he's stealing bases, he's getting tons of hit. He's just getting on base a lot. And it's very clear that he's not going to be at Lakeland for long, even though found this article of how the town, the local chamber of commerce doesn't want Ron LeFlore to leave because again, these cities depend on the local minor league teams to stimulate the economy. And when the star player like Ron LeFlore and by this point people know about his background, he brings in an audience, and he's also being asked to speak at schools, speak at your local civic clubs. So they don't want him to go, but of course the Tigers are like, no, we need to move him up. So he skips double A and he goes straight to triple A. And that at that time is in Evansville, Indiana. Ron is only in Evansville for something like 9 days. And he really doesn't, if you look at his numbers, they're not very impressive. But when you begin to look at how he's playing from day to day, the first couple games he doesn't do well because he ends up only playing like 5 or 6 games. But then there's about 3 or 4 games in between where he's hitting the ball really hard, he's getting on base, and he's starting to show again his potential and that he's still very raw, but like you could see this guy on a major league club, but he still needed a lot of training still. He still needed probably another season before he would be called up. That was the assumption, at least. And then center fielder Mickey Stanley for the Detroit Tigers gets injured. And uh, Billy Martin's no longer the manager. It's Ralph Houck. And Houck looks at his bench and he's like, these guys, they can fill in, but they're not gonna change the trajectory of this team. Who else do we have, in the farm? And so the general manager, Hauk, and then the minor league coaches get together. They're like basically on a conference call, and they're trying to figure out who should they elevate. There's two other players besides Ron that they're considering. Both those other players have been playing in the Detroit farm system much longer. They are obviously they don't have a prison record. One's a really good hitter, but he's new to the outfield, so his defensive experience would be something that he would need to work on. Then the other player was a much more complete player. He's by the name of Leon Roberts. Both players ended up in the major leagues, but neither of them had any sort of career as impressive as Ron did. And so one of the coaches was for I forget his name, the player who's a good hitter, and then another coach is for Leon Roberts. And then it was Ralph Houck's decision, as well as the general managers, who they were going to bring up. And they took a chance, and they knew they were taking a big risk. And they said, you know what, we're going to take Ron up. We have nothing to lose. And they didn't. They had a horrible season in 1974, and they brought Ron up. And Ron didn't get off to a great start, but eventually he settles down and he's the leadoff hitter. So he's not even given any time to adjust. He literally is called up, and in that same day, it's a night game, and he's the very first hitter. So he has absolutely no time to just take it all in. He is just thrown out onto the plate, and eventually, he does settle down and he becomes one of the best hitters in the American League for about 5 seasons.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so much we could talk about that on the field presence and success he had as a base stealer, batting average, scoring runs, one of the top outfielders in the American League. But obviously, his story beyond the field is so compelling. And as you mentioned, there's the movie uh, made about his life. What did you learn about? There's been so many good books, just about like the oral history of the making of a certain movie, and I'm sure that was fun to research this important piece of his life. LeVar Burton coming off Roots, probably no more famous actor in America at that time, in some ways, going to play him. what are some interesting facts you learned or stories you learned about the making of the movie and how that affected Ron's life?
Well, first of all, LeVar Burton is not a very good athlete. So that was challenging, but he made up for it with his acting. One of the things I found really interesting about LeVar Burton, he made this analogy, which it never dawned on me until I came across it. So, in Roots is, of course, about slavery and how slaves were taken to America, and then what it was like to live, in that situation for quite some time. And one of the episodes that LeVar experienced when he was filming, he was 19 years old. He was a college student, and he had to psych himself up to what it would feel like to be a slave on a ship. And when he was filming One in a Million, which is the Ron LeFlore story, and one of the scenes takes place in a prison cell where he's held in solitary confinement. He said it was just like what I felt like when I was on that slave ship, you know, to feel like you don't have any freedom, you can't move, and you're just stuck, and there's no hope. That's exactly what it felt like. And that's why if you watch the movie, I mean, LeVar Burton, and it's dated, so you have to take that into consideration. But it was a really impressive performance on his end. But the movie only made Ron, more cocky than ever. So as humble as Ron was, it seemed to eventually have dissipated. And by 1976, so this is 2 years before the movie, Ron is an all-star. He's the best hitter, at least, on the Tigers. He's also just one of the most dangerous base stealers on the paths. So he was the leadoff hitter. He was a big name. And everyone knew who he was because of his past. And then by 1978, he's getting offers, to have a book written about himself, and then that book becomes a top seller. And at the time, made-for-television movies were a common thing, and so CBS picked up the book and optioned it to make it into a movie. And so Ron was really at the peak of his fame, and he truly was a celebrity. And so the movie only enhanced his reputation and his obviously his financial potential. And it was quite a experience for him. He really enjoyed it. He got to watch some of the filming. Obviously, he wasn't in the movie, but some of the players and coaches that were like Billy Martin, Al Kaline, and some others. And Ron, he partied with LeVar Burton. He was telling me when they were at Tiger Stadium, the fans came out to serve as extras because that's where they filmed some of the scenes. I even got to interview an extra who was a college baseball player. So they needed players on the field, and they weren't able to obviously get the Tigers or any other clubs. So they recruited for college baseball players, and I was able to interview one of them. And he was just telling me about, the experience and how that LeVar Burton would struggle at the plate, and they basically had to do like 30 takes just for him to get a base hit, you know. LeVar Burton also is not a very big guy. In fact, there's a picture in the book where he's standing in between, or no, he's standing next to Ron LeFlore and Billy Martin, and he's short, he's petite, but like I said, he's a great actor, and they were able to make it work.
Yeah. Um, you've mentioned a few times like the strokes of good fortune that Ron has had in his life, counterbalancing some of the obviously extremely difficult circumstances also. And thinking about his post baseball life, and you mentioned at the very beginning, you're interested whatever happened to Ron LeFlore, and so many athletes have a difficult time adjusting. He didn't necessarily grow up with the identity as an athlete, but eventually, he's this Major League Baseball player, star of a movie. It must have been an especially difficult transition for him from baseball, and by all accounts, it seems like it was. Like, what were the main uh, factors that contributed to the difficulties he had after baseball?
Well, it was primarily drugs. You would have thought that Ron would have learned his lesson, but unfortunately he didn't. And so, again, at the time of his celebrity, where he peaked, it's 78, 79, 80. What's going on? It's the disco era. It's Studio 54. He leaves the Tigers, goes to Montreal, which is a nightclub hopping city. And he gets really deep into cocaine, and very common among a lot of baseball players, a lot of athletes, a lot of celebrities. And because he's a name, everyone is shoving it in his face, and he's just taking full advantage of it. And it takes a toll on his marriage, his children, and his career. It is, derailed as a result of his excessive drug use. And by 1983, he's out of baseball. He's in his last year with the White Sox. They end up having to pay him, even though he didn't even make the cut for the 40-man roster. He didn't even make it out of spring training. So he was with the White Sox for 2 seasons. They weren't memorable. And by 83, they cut him loose, even though they still have to pay him. And at that time, he's making about $750,000. And this is in 1982, 83, which is the equivalent today to about $3 million. Well, all of that money is gone. And by the late 80s, he's working as a sky cap, he's working as a security guard, he's working as an umpire, he's on the baseball card autograph circuit, which a lot of former baseball players do, but he didn't play long enough to have a significant pension. So to this day, that's pretty much what he lives off of. And unfortunately, because Ron was so cocky, he didn't think about the consequences of his actions. And Ron ran his mouth, and he didn't placate to the higher ups. And so as a result, when a lot of players were getting jobs as assistants, in the front office or even becoming coaches and managers, there were no offers for Ron. He was able to become a baseball manager in the minor leagues, but it was for an independent affiliated team. So a team that was not affiliated with any sort of major league club. And those didn't work out. He really wasn't cut out to be a manager. In fact, one of his former players told me he didn't even know my name. He didn't know anyone's name. He would just call
Mhm.
everyone motherfucker. So, and I could see that. I mean, Ron is Ron. He just, you know, um, but unfortunately, he really makes a disaster of his legacy, especially with the Tigers in 1999. It's the final year that they play at Tiger Stadium. And on the final game, they have this big tribute and they bring in every living player. And they bring him out to the field, including Ron, and they have this wonderful ceremony. And after the game, Ron's heading to his car and the police stop him and he gets arrested for not paying child support. And instead of the tributes that had happened the night before, on the front page of the sports section is Ron's arrest. And that essentially is the final nail in the coffin. And the Tigers have no communication with Ron, according to Ron. They don't want to have anything to do with him. And so it's made it very difficult for Ron to monetize his playing career. And so he's up until really the pandemic was reliant on doing the baseball card shows, signing his name, making appearances. He would be flown out to Michigan. He would do it often in Florida. He would sometimes have his name associated with like a baseball camp. Anything to supplement his pension, but it's been tough for him. And recently, unfortunately, he's had a lot of health issues.
Mhm. Yeah, part of his leg amputated. Given where his life is now, uh, why do you think he cooperated on the book without being paid? Often you would expect, well, the guy's going to ask, well, I'll do interviews if you'll pay me, and what were those conversations like? You said Ron is Ron. Like, what was it like? Uh, your conversations with him?
The very first time I spoke to him, I was nervous because I was like, oh my God, I'm talking to Ron LeFlore. Um, I think anytime you talk to someone who is from like your childhood, who was kind of a larger than life character, it's natural, right? But after a few conversations, I was in my element, and talking to Ron was a lot of fun. I think he enjoyed it as much as I did in terms of going back and reminiscing. Ron initially did ask me, how much are you going to pay me? And I said, I'm not paying you anything.
Mm,
Because once I pay you, it changes the relationship and it changes what this, how this can, this can, um, how this story can be told. I said, you can be very cooperative and share your story. Because I'm going to be honest with you, Ron, there are very few non-Hall of Fame baseball players who have a full-length biography written about them. It's highly unusual, and your story is worth telling. And eventually, if I don't do it, I'm sure someone else will. But I would like to do it while you're alive, and so you can provide your own input and perspective on your own life story. But I'm going to provide the context, and I'm also not going to hide the ugly, the bad, the things that I know you don't want people to know about, but that's part of your life. You're a public figure. And I think he just sensed that I was very sincere and I was honest. And I I also think too, because Ron had, I believe, largely been forgotten. He wasn't getting a lot of calls either about other people wanting to do his story. So that was advantageous for me. And so he went along with it. And every so often he would ask me, are you still going to pay me? And I'd be like, listen, Ron, my hope is that this book will revitalize your legacy and people will take another look at it, not because you deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, because honestly, you didn't play long enough, you certainly were on the trajectory of becoming a Hall of Fame caliber player. And a lot of your teammates saw that. And unfortunately, Ron didn't take advantage of their advice. And I think if he had, he certainly would have been in Cooperstown. But nevertheless, your story deserves to be told, and there's so much to it. It's not just about what you overcame, but it's also what life is like for so many other athletes, and we don't appreciate what they had to overcome. You didn't have anything given to you. You had to work for it. And I think people really appreciate the story, and maybe it will lead to opportunities that will pay off. And that's basically what I told Ron. I was very honest with him. I kept my word. He didn't read. In fact, to date, he has not read the book yet. I am going to send him a copy. But he is aware of the quotes because I had to get his permission and get him to sign off on it, and he did. So anything where I directly quoted him from, which was quite significant, um, he had to sign off on it.
okay, okay, very interesting. All right, well, Adam, thank you. This is a terrific book on a really fascinating life, handled so well by your pen, and highly recommend the book Baseball's Outcast, Story of Ron LeFlore, coming out April 2nd, right as we're kicking off the baseball season. Uh, and for someone my age, I'm 56, that name, Ron LeFlore, um, that era of baseball with so many interesting characters. It seems like a story like that just wouldn't happen these days. This what a unusual baseball life. Reading the toward the epilogue, it's a sad story too, and even the episode where they're going to have a film screening and things don't quite go the way they're supposed to when he's going to have this day in his honor, but at least the day happens, and this book, like you say, it brings the name back out there, and it lets people understand that more than just the trivia aspect of this former inmate who makes it to the major leagues. We learn the full story behind it and what happens after. So, congratulations on the book, Adam. For people who are interested in learning more about this book or the other books that you've written, or want to follow you various places, how can people do that?
Well, I would start with my website. So it's my name, adamhenig.com. And then also I'm on Blue Sky. So feel free to reach out to me. And you can learn all about the books I've written, articles I've written. And yeah, and thank you so much for having me on your show.
All right. Thank you, Adam. Take care.